I took another look at the video that I had made a few years ago, and the quality is not so wonderful and it's a little jerky. So I decided to do another one and perhaps add some things that are related more to you and to our class. I've begun to read many of your responses. Hopefully there'll be a lot more. And some of what I'm saying will have some relationship to those responses. Much of this will be about the latter part of the story, but there are two aspects of this that might be useful before we get into what I would talk about as the internal reading, the reading of the story here as a conversation between Cain and God. We'll get to that in a minute. The nature of the conversation so far, even along your posts, looks to begin with what is the argument that they're having and why are they having this argument. It's interesting for me as you raise the question, it's pretty clear why they're having this argument, since God seemed to like Abel's sacrifice more than Cain's. Another interesting piece in the story is, how did Cain know that God liked Abel's sacrifice more than his? It doesn't really tell us about that. It's interesting just to ask ourselves why the rabbis felt the need to do this. And I think, as I might have posted, Vayihi biyotam b'sadeh, and it happened while they were in the field, that Cain arose on top of Abel his brother and killed him. So the first part begins, and Cain said to Abel, Vayomer Cain el hevel achiv vayihi biyotam b'sadeh, and Cain said to Abel his brother. In the Hebrew, there is a real gap there. What did Cain say to Abel his brother? We really wonder about that. And as we wrote in the postings, this becomes an opportunity for the rabbis to reflect on, why do people argue? This is the first argument in the world. And they offer a number of suggestions, sort of generic suggestions. What are the fundamental things that people argue about sex, or about women, or about property, or about honor? Those are some of the things that they talked about. The other interesting thing, just to begin with, when it says Vayakom Cain el hevel achiv, one of the other questions, as I read this midrash, I see that you read it differently than I, but that's fine. As I read this midrash, one of the questions that they're asking is, how is it that the good guy Abel loses? How is it that Cain is the one who's able to emerge triumphant? How does this, in terms of questions of good and evil? And the way that I read that midrash is that, in fact, Abel was actually winning the battle. Abel was on top of Cain. And Cain used subterfuge to get Abel off of him, saying, well, what's your mother going to say in all of this? And then he was able to get the upper hand. And Vayakom Cain, of course, means that he got from being underneath to being on top. And Vayakom means that, in a sense, and that's that he assaulted him. Because the passage ends with the idea that somehow the wicked people, the evil people, can use your softer parts, your compassion and so on against you. And you have to be very careful about that, because that's one of the ways that evil can triumph in the world. At least that's sort of the way that I'm reading this particular midrash. If we go on to the fundamental area that I wanted to open up to you, it begins with God saying to Cain, E hevel achicha, where is Abel your brother? This famous passage, where is Abel your brother? You can ask, why is God asking that question as part of the story? But then Cain responds, Lo yadati, I don't know, it's usually translated. But as I mentioned in one of the posts, Lo yadati can also mean, from the past tense, I didn't know. What is it that he didn't know? And then he says, Hashomer achi anochi, am I my brother's keeper? In this conversation with God, perhaps what Abel is saying is, I didn't know. I didn't know what death was. I hit him a few times perhaps, but I didn't know that I'd be killing him. Am I my brother's keeper? And one might say that there's been no death in the world. It's a perfectly appropriate response for Cain to say, I didn't know that was going to have such horrible impact, such a horrible thing. What's interesting here is he could have said, Lo yadati, I didn't know that killing was wrong. But that's never raised. It looks like from the perspective of the narrators of the Bible itself, that would not have been an appropriate response. Everybody, a human being, knows that killing is wrong, and that's not even raised. So when he says, Hashomer achi anochi, so that's a question that he's asking God. And the second question that he asks God, Hashomer achi anochi, am I my brother's keeper? The rabbis, and not all of these are taken from the materials that you have, the rabbis have read this as the emphasis on the last word, anochi, I, and could be read with this, instead of reading it, am I my brother's keeper, it could be read with the intonation, am I my brother's keeper? Where were you, God? How come you didn't intervene? The story that you did see in the Midrash, where the two athletes are fighting, and the king is standing around and doesn't do anything. So Cain is saying, you're the one who created us, you're the one who created me. Don't you, somehow or other, where were you in all this? How come you didn't stop me? I'm just a newly created kind of being. Why didn't you do something? Is it all my fault? And God's response to this is, again, reading under, in between the lines, Me'asita. What did you do? Not, I don't have any responsibility for this. You're the one that did it. Me'asita. What did you do? Kol d'mei achicha tzoakim elai min ha'adama. This is not my doing. The voice of your brother's blood screams to me from the ground. And the Hebrew word, it's not called dam achicha, the blood, but the bloods, as it were, the spattered blood that's all over the place. You made darn sure that he was going to die. Don't give me this business. I didn't know what death was. I didn't know this. You beat him up so bad that his blood is spattered all over the ground. So you bear the responsibility for this, and that blood is screaming to me from the earth. Of course, you might say screaming to me maybe means that Abel is also screaming to God. How come you didn't intervene? How come you didn't stop? That I haven't seen in the Midrash. And just to conclude this particular sort of in between the lines conversation between Cain and God, in verse 13, God says after Cain says after God has told him that he's going to be a wanderer throughout the land, Cain says to God, Gadol avoni minaso. My punishment is too great to bear. Again, some of the rabbis, and again, this isn't something that you have, Gadol avoni minaso. The word avon has a double meaning. Avon can mean punishment, and avon can mean sin. The usual understanding of avon is sin. And instead of saying it in a declarative way, Cain says it as a question. Gadol avoni minaso. Is my sin too great for you to take at least a little bit of it to bear? Right? Don't you bear some responsibility for this thing that's happened? And he talks about how God has evicted him from the garden, and in fact God softens. In verse 15, Vayomer lo Adonai lachein kol horei Cain shivatayim yakum. So God says, look, as you're wandering around, anyone who kills Cain will be revenged sevenfold. And he put a mark on Cain, levilti hakototo kol motzo. So the mark of Cain is in fact a defense for Cain. It's a sign for Cain that nobody can touch him, nobody can hurt him, even though he had done this horrible thing. So it's not actually, he gave him a sign, and it's interesting that one of the midrashim says that the sign doesn't say he put it on his body. Some of the midrashim say he gave him something. One is that he gave him a dog, and the dog accompanied him and defended him if anybody would attack him. So what this reading of the biblical story, at least it did for me when I first confronted this, and I've been teaching this for years and years and really enjoy opening up this story in so many ways, that this reading of the story makes the story alive in a different way, brings the characters to life in a different way, and creates a way for me to engage the story in ways that I wouldn't have before. And it's also fascinating to me that this story and the way of thinking about this was generated 2,000 years ago. And every generation reads it in its own way, but that I resonate to this story and to the way the rabbis asked these questions so many years ago, that somehow there's this continuity from the biblical story itself to the rabbinic readings, and then of course to the readings that came later on. So I hope you enjoyed this. I certainly have enjoyed your reading of these materials.